As many of you know, I recently published a book on the ethics and the epistemology of the so-called anti-COVID vaccines. The title is The Death of the Phronimos, where Phronimos is the Greek term for wise person, the person with practical wisdom in Aristotle's ethics. The exemplary rule for moral action in Christian ethics would be Jesus Christ, the person we should look at to understand what to do morally. And the subtitle is Faith and Truth about the Anti-COVID Vaccines. And I just published another one called Vaccination as an Act of Love, the Ethics and Epistemology, the Epistemology of Ethical Choice in Times of Pandemics, if I remember correctly the English title. These books are part of a bigger effort to write about all the ethical and epistemological aspects of these vaccines and pandemics in general. Since I published the first one, and actually since my first public comments about these so-called vaccines, a typical objection against me was that since I'm not a virologist or a physician or a biologist, I'm not an expert, so I shouldn't talk about the vaccines. I should let the experts talk. Now, I find this objection not only false, but misleading and dangerous, highly dangerous for political debate and for public information, for the public faith. So I need to reply. I need to explain why I'm an expert, and for many reasons I'm more expert than physicians and biologists or statisticians or whatever, epidemiologists. I'm not more expert in the sense that I know more than they do about their own disciplines, of course, but because my viewpoint is more important right now. And I'm telling you why, briefly. And this is something I talk extensively in my books. First of all, I need to explain a key point in epistemology. Now, when you study a certain object, you can approach it from different viewpoints or angles. Imagine that you are looking at the object human being. You need to study the human being. Now, the human being can be studied scientifically, technically, from different viewpoints and angles or disciplines or sciences. For example, you study the human being as a moving object while you're doing physics. You study the molecular composition of the human being somehow, you're doing chemistry. You're studying his past, you're doing history. You study his reaction, his psychological reaction to the environment, you're doing psychology. For example, how some pressures, especially from the public authorities, may affect the freedom of people. Okay, you're doing even sociology. If you study the human being from the viewpoint of being healthy, you're doing medicine. So you're studying the human being from very peculiar, viewpoint. Now, but if you study the existence of the human being in a community with other people, you're doing politics. The way I mean politics in this context would be partly political philosophy and partly philosophical anthropology or philosophy of the human being. My point is that you can study the very same object, materially speaking, the human being, from many different perspectives. And each perspective, each viewpoint determines your methodology, your tools. For example, how can you evaluate if something that a physician tells you doesn't belong to his science, so it's a false statement. If it is taken as a scientific statement, it's false. How can you determine this? Or a biologist, for example. Well, you should wonder what is the tool, the instrument that the physician or the biologist has. What are the tools that the physician or the biologist has in its lab or scientific place that can allow for that conclusion? For example, if a physician tells me that a certain law doesn't violate my constitutional rights, well, how can medical science generate this conclusion? Clearly, there is no tool in medicine that allows for this conclusion. So you need someone expert in constitutional law and maybe political philosophy to make that statement. If a biologist tells me that we need a lockdown, well, what kind of biological tool does he use to generate this conclusion? Because you need to understand something. When you do scientific knowledge of reality is that very specific knowledge we have as human beings, not the only one. We know through experience, we know through faith, we know in many ways, but when we do scientific knowledge, we know through demonstration. We start from some premises, and with the path that should be explained, we reach a certain conclusion, right? But your premises are the ones that in your science should justify the conclusion. So if you tell me that I need to take this public measure of the lockdown, how can you reach this conclusion from biological premises? Clearly, you are not doing your science, you're doing something different. Now, as a human being, you may have an opinion about this, but it's not your science. So, if you think of the emergency use authorizations, right, which is the key, the crucial decision our societies made between the end of 2020 and early 2021 about these so-called vaccines, right? But the decisions about emergency use authorization, strangely enough, have been made mostly by physicians and also with the support, especially of epidemiology, which is statistics, nothing more than statistics, right? Numbers applied and calculation applied to the population, right? But this decision is not of medical nature. Now, what is the premise? What are the premises of this decision? The premises are ethical and political and legal. You need a state of emergency declared by a public political authority, which means that compared to the regular situation of a certain state or nation, the political authority thinks that there is something so out of the ordinary that requires extraordinary measures, public action to be taken care of. So the state of emergency clearly is not a medical decision, it's a political decision. It should look at many aspects of political life and the political community. It needs to be done in accordance with the law and especially with constitutional principles. So it needs a qualified viewpoint from experts in law and constitutional theory and political philosophy and political theory and sociology. It needs, and of course it needs also a viewpoint from, in a case of a pandemic, from medicine and epidemiology, but it's not a decision that as a conclusion is justified by medical science. You understand this, right? I mean, this is very important. So if you don't let other experts talk from their viewpoint about these things, you're not acting scientifically. You are acting ideologically. You are giving too much power to a science to express opinions which don't belong, as such, to his science. Same goes with the emergency use authorizations, which is actually something that goes beyond science. This is very important. So the emergency use authorization is something that breaks the regular process of science. It's telling me that since we have such an emergency, which has been legally correctly declared by the relevant public authority, we need some tools to react. We need to take care of this emergency. And since the usual science process of a new drug to be sure that it's safe and effective takes roughly 5 years, so this is the safety protocol, right, for a new drug. You know, putting into the market a new drug is worse than, you know, giving a driver license to someone, right? Because if you give the driver license to the wrong person, you may have a car accident, a bad one, right? But you don't have a genocide, you don't have thousands of people dying maybe, or having serious health conditions. But if you put in the market the wrong drug, or too early to know what's going to happen with that drug, you are generating a huge danger for the entire population. So it's a huge deal. And it's an administrative process. You need to, as a political community, you need to give this license for driving a drug, a new drug in society, which is a huge, terrible risk. It's a political decision. It needs right protocols from science to be sure that it's not going to hurt. Now, but the emergency decision breaks the usual process of science. So it cannot be sure that it's safe. But since we have an emergency, we are, politically speaking, ethically speaking, legally speaking, willing to give up safety because of certain efficacy of this drug in taking care of this very important emergency, right? So this balance, this decision that puts on balance, right, safety, breaking science, right, interrupting the usual process of science in favor of some efficacy, is not a medical decision, it's a political decision, it's a legal decision. It's a decision that puts in danger even the most important constitutional rights of people. So who are the experts for this decision? Well, there is not just one expert, of course. I mean, you need enough experts from different disciplines. Certainly you need physicians and epidemiologists and virologists and biologists. You need all those kind of scientists. But you also need ethicists, you need lawyers, you need politicians, you need somehow the entire community with all the relevant disciplines coming together and making a very prudent decision. Now, a prudent decision is actually the very definition of ethics. Ethics is the science that helps making a good decision. And the good decision needs to take all the possible viewpoints together. I'll give you an example to understand why this overall viewpoint belongs, properly speaking, to ethics. Let's say that the physician tells me that in order to heal, to get better, I should stay in bed for at least a week. So you should not get off your bed for at least a week. Now, if the physician is a good one, his opinion probably is correct. In order to heal, to get better, I need to stay in bed for a week. But the point is, ought I to stay in bed for a week or not? Well, it depends, because the medical viewpoint is not the only one about my life. I may have something so important to do, saving my kids, or giving them food, or running as I'm in charge of a team of firefighters. I may have a bunch of other commitments that would take precedence according to my ethical evaluation to getting better this week. Now, the physician, as a physician, cannot tell me that this is a wrong decision. He can only tell me that, technically speaking, this decision will make me feel worse from the viewpoint of my health, right? But that viewpoint is not the only one. Now, an engineer, a construction engineer, may even tell me that I need to get up right away from my bed because there is an earthquake emergency, and my house is in danger of collapsing. So I have a technical viewpoint from an engineer who tells me that according to his science, I need to get up right away from my bed. I have another technical viewpoint from a physician who tells me that I should stay in bed for a week at least in order to get better. I have two different technical viewpoints conflicting with one another. They are both right from their viewpoint. My ethical decision is independent because my ethical decision is the decision that I make from an overall viewpoint that needs to balance every other viewpoint compared to the good of my entire life and existence. Is the same thing that in the political community we need to do when you have difficult decisions that require several viewpoints. The political choice for the common good is higher and bigger than each specific discipline. And clearly, in a case like this, there are so many aspects that belong to other sciences. I would say that in any decision about these vaccines, we need trained experts, senior ones, at least in law and ethics. Let me give you another example about risk and benefit ratio, which has been a huge deal for especially the emergency use authorizations of the vaccines. Now, the way newspapers, mainstream media have talked about this is like this is an evaluation that the experts are epidemiologists or physicians or virologists should give us about the vaccines. But this is not correct. The main doubt about emergency use authorizations is that precisely because they made a 5-year safety scientific protocol in experimental science about new drugs, it made it shorter from 5 years to 2 months, more or less. It raised the huge issue of unknowns about risks, negative effects of these drugs. Now, clearly, having some kind of positive balance between risk and benefits is a legal requirement for the emergency use authorizations. As a legal requirement, of course, it needs to be legally evaluated, which is something I don't think has been done correctly at FDA, by the FDA, and by EMA in Europe too. Think about it this way. It's not an evaluation that belongs to medical science at all. Why? Because most of the negative effects are totally unpredictable, are a total unknown. Now, there is no science about the unknown. if somebody tells you that there is a science about what is completely unknown in the future, is misleading you for some reason, is giving you wrong news, wrong science. There is no science, there is no expert. Let me give you an analogical example, just to make it clear, to understand what I'm talking about. Let's say that now we wonder what we would do as a state, for example, the United States of America, in case of alien attacks to the Earth, against the Earth. So how can we react to aliens coming to attack the Earth? To what expert should we ask for advice? I mean, there is no way to know. There is some kind of, we can fantasize about this. We can make any kind of assumption or hypothesis. Because we don't know if these aliens will be defeated by, I don't know, some flowers rather than some virus or some nuclear weapon. We don't know anything about aliens. We don't know who they are and how they will attack the Earth. So we can just make assumptions. And everybody's good making assumptions, right? So in the case of negative effects of drugs, just a few of them can be hypothesized. Because you work on some previous knowledge of other drugs, you can make some hypotheses. But truly, in the case of the human body, when you put a new substance in the human body, you don't know really what's going to happen unless you observe the human body for long enough to understand what kind of reaction they're going to be. That's why you need long time to figure that out, and you need statistics mostly. It's not a theoretical science that has been verified, but who knows what kind of lab experiment, like the atomic particles in the accelerator. No. This is just observing statistically what's going to happen. If you don't do that because it belongs to the future, there is no way to predict what's going to happen. So this evaluation belongs to a prudent person who knows all the possible facts right now about these vaccines and makes a prudent judgment related mostly to the benefit that you expect in the short term. But if people let you believe that there is a scientific opinion about it that some experts possess, this is a fraud. Now, as an expert in ethical theory, in legal theory, in epistemology, I may be more of an expert, more qualified to express an opinion about this balance of unknown risks with alleged efficacy in the short term than a pediatrician or a physician from the FDA or its independent scientific committee. And one of the main problems with this committee and these people at the FDA is that they don't include all the expertise they should include, and so they let people believe that there is a scientific approach. So the point is this one: let's actually have the experts talk. I agree about that. I totally agree. The only thing is that we need all the experts, not just some physicians or virologists or epidemiologists who are talking constantly about science, about ethics, about politics, about law, about the constitutional rights of people. For some reason, mainstream media kind of glorified some experts in some disciplines as if they had possessed the science about everything, and they could talk from all different possible angles about everything, which is wrong, which is false.